I'd like to welcome Mike Abito, and he is a professor of business economics and public policy here at Wharton. And he's going to talk to us about the Clean Power Plan, which is a signature accomplishment, I think, the Obama administration would say. And it's designed to limit the carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel plants, such as oil-fired, coal-fired, natural gas-fired, and doing that by setting a price for those emissions. And I think one of the big questions is, how do you actually do that? Do you do that from a federal level or a state level? And there's lots of rules and all of that that affect this. But the question is, are they efficient? And how much trouble does it cause the producers and then ultimately the consumers who would, for whom it would be reflected in prices? So would you please talk about, and he's written a paper on this, of course, that this is all based on, and could you give us a summary of what your research has found?
Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting me to talk about this paper. So basically in this project, what we look at is the Clean Power Plan, which is the landmark policy that would address of the Obama administration to address CO2 emissions. And in this project, we're zeroing in on this issue of, although the Clean Power Plan is a is based on a federal level law, such as the Clean Air Act, implementation of the Clean Power Plan rule is actually at the state level. So this fact that you have different jurisdictions coming up with different rules or coming up with different ways to implement the policy may actually create inefficiencies as opposed to being able to coordinate everyone at the federal level. So this is really what we're studying in this paper.
And what were some of the conclusions? What did you find as you looked into it?
So what's interesting here is that with emissions, so we're looking at emissions coming from, as you said, coal-fired power plants. And so we focus on PJM, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland interconnection, which is basically a grid that is that covers, or a wholesale market that covers 13 states. And so firms who own power plants, they produce across these 13 states, and then the electricity that they produce, they sell it in a single market, PJM, and then they get a single price. And what we recognize is that although CO2 emissions may be regulated at the state level, so let's focus on PJM. So let's say there's a CO2 permit market for each state. So there are 13 markets. They can't trade among each other. That really sounds like a very inefficient scenario. But when a firm who owns plants, let's say in Pennsylvania and Delaware, is thinking about, where should I produce? Okay, they're gonna look at the CO2 price in Pennsylvania and compare it with the CO2 price in Delaware, and somehow decide, okay, where should I produce based on these CO2 prices? So even though seemingly these are disconnected markets, the fact that firms who participate in the single market for electricity actually make decisions that take into account the distribution of prices across states somehow implicitly coordinates these separate markets such that, as we found in the research that we did, such that it actually alleviates or mitigates some of the inefficiencies of these separate markets.
So a power company, regardless of what state they reside in and what the rules are of that state, can easily, being part of this grid you're describing, produce that electricity in one of the other states that's part of that grid.
So
and so it doesn't, to them, they're sort of indifferent to the regulation, except to the extent that they're going to produce it where it's cheapest, the least cost.
Exactly.
Right.
So suppose you have two plants producing electricity exactly the same, costs exactly the same. The only difference is that CO2 price in Pennsylvania is more expensive or it's higher than in Delaware. Then, of course, I'm going to move my production to Delaware. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is you're pretty much limited with how much you can reallocate output, because the reason why probably prices in Pennsylvania is more expensive is because a lot of production is being made in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. So you have big plants in Pennsylvania as opposed to small plants in Delaware. So it's like I can't really move majority of my output from Pennsylvania to Delaware because it's cheaper in Delaware. So here what we identify as the main mechanism in the paper is actually investment. And the fact that investment is the main mechanism has consequences in terms of, what's going to happen to electricity prices, because of how we design the policy.
Mm-hmm. And so was this all to answer the question that we have these new rules, they're imposing, it's a big change, it's a big restriction on companies, and then maybe it was thought that it's causing even more ripples and problems because now it's got to go from the federal level to the state level, and it's complicated, and that's just churning up all this inefficiency you're talking about. So was the purpose of the paper to show that, well, in fact, the way that the market is set up kind of bypasses all of that?
In a way, it kind of has that message. So I guess we're coming from the premise that having states coordinate and have a single market and agree on and have a consensus of how to design a single market, it's a difficult proposition. I mean, you could think about it with a bigger picture. Like imagine, we're all hoping for a global CO2 market.
Right.
But, in order to have that, you have to have China, the U.S., each of these countries actually agree on the details of this market.
Could take a while.
Could take a while or even forever. The point of the paper is that, okay, wait a minute. We don't need to really aim for that. We can actually, the fact that, somehow we're talking about CO2 emissions, but it's coming from certain activities, as long as these activities are coordinated across these different entities,
a big enough group
coverage, then we can actually do something.
So that's interesting. So it's kind of a hopeful message that you can actually apply some restrictions that will help keep carbon out of the atmosphere, and you don't need to have it coordinated internationally or even across the U.S. And these regions are already set up on grids that cooperate and coordinate, because when one plant has a sudden demand and can't meet it, there's a grid that they can draw on from an area that's not using it at the moment. So,
although in the project we're focusing on the PJM, which is
PGM, just so we make
Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland,
right? Okay.
Which is the market that covers Pennsylvania.
Yes. Okay.
Although we're focusing on that, there are a bunch of regional markets in the U.S. As you said, they're actually still somehow interconnected.
Right.
Yeah.
And as we talk about building infrastructure, which is something that both presidential candidates talked about, and now we have a new president who presumably might follow through on that. Some of that could be on the electrical grid, which would mean different regions could more easily connect to each other, and that would create an even greater level of efficiency. Is that?
We don't address that in the project, but it's one of the things that is part of what we plan to look at in the future.
Okay, so that's the kind of thing you'll look at in the future.
Yeah.
So what surprised you when you started looking at this? Did you come to the conclusion that you thought you would, or was that surprising?
We kind of, the basic economics is there. We kind of understood the basic economics, but how far? Because so specifically, we're looking at our primary focus was on electricity prices under state by state, which is having separate markets, versus regional, where over PJM there's a single market. Our hope, we understood the economics, but once you go into the data, it might tell you something else. So we were hoping that at least these are the electricity prices under the state by state and regional are very close. In fact, that's actually what we found, right? What surprised us a lot is that profits are actually end up to be better in the state by state as opposed to regional case. And that was really, in a way, surprising to us. And it's only recently that we actually understood what was happening.
Could you explain that?
Yeah, because it's kind of counterintuitive in the sense that, with the state by state, it seems that the laws are more stringent, right, as opposed to the regional case. And the reason why you actually end up with higher profits with state by state is that, this is not a general thing, but it just so happens that, given how much it costs to invest, what is your portfolio of plans, and what kind of investments you can make, the fact that, with your current portfolio of plans, you're barely making any money, okay? That's what we mean by, basically the price that you're getting in the market is almost exactly equal to your cost. Okay? And these plants, once you introduce the CPP, the cost is going to go up. But demand for electricity is what you call, at least in the short term, is very inelastic in the sense that people are willing to pay, almost any amount just to get that specific amount of electricity, right? So what's going to happen is that when costs go up, prices are going to go up in the same proportion, and people are willing to pay for that. But that creates a very strong incentive to invest. Okay, so once you invest, and the fact that you're investing in technologies that are cleaner and actually more efficient, that means that when you compare the existing plant's cost versus the new investment, the gap is like this. But then, because of stringent laws, this is actually going to go up. So the reward from investing is actually much higher.
So is that to say that that these increased regulations actually provide an incentive to modernize?
Exactly. So,
Okay.
I mean, at the end of the day, at some point in time, all of these coal plants are going to get retired,
Right.
or going to.
Yeah, their days are numbered.
There's a number. What a stringent CPP or a state-by-state CPP does is it basically makes it faster. Okay, it's
Speeds
going to
up.
give a really strong signal.
Speeds up the retirement
Exactly.
of these plants.
And here, the underlying assumption in our models is that firms are profit maximizing. We're not coercing them to invest. We're not forcing them to invest. It's just that the reward from investing is actually much higher with a stricter law. Yeah.
And when you're producing electricity, it's not like there's a thousand different markets you can go to. You're wired into your location.
Exactly.
You're not going
You're
overseas.
participating
You're
in
not
the market.
going to Mars.
Exactly. You can't even store it, for
You
example.
can't even store
Once
it.
you produce it, it has to go there.
Although that may change, right? With the
With
batteries they're talking
batteries
about.
and stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said you gave us one example of something you'll be looking at next. What else will you be looking at?
So actually, what's interesting is that I work with a bunch of co-authors in this paper, and I basically didn't sleep this morning. I was watching the elections, and the moment that we got the results of the election, my co-author emailed like, what's going to happen to the CPP? So a little bit of background. So CPP right now, although it was the Clean Power Plan, although it was the final rule was put in the Federal Register last year around around October 2015. In February 2016, the Supreme Court actually put a stay on it. So right now, whether the Clean Power Plan will actually push through depends on several things. One is who won the presidency, and which we know already by now. And so what's going to happen to the composition of the Supreme Court? What's going to happen to the EPA? So one of my co-authors was pretty worried about, what's going to happen to the project? Because if there's no CPP, then why are we talking about this? But I think our project, the fact that we're focusing on these separate markets, different jurisdictions, as opposed to a coordinated way to regulate emissions, actually says something about this environment where we don't have CPP. So that's something that our current project has something to say about, but we need to do more research. So what do I mean specifically? So suppose there's no CPP. Suppose the EPA gets abolished. Okay, there's no CPP, there's nothing. But individual states actually can act and decide to regulate themselves.
I see.
Okay, as long as, what if Pennsylvania and Delaware individually decide to regulate themselves? They might not be able to coordinate because they don't have this umbrella of the Clean Power Plan, but they can do, by themselves these kinds of initiatives. And we would be interested, at least in future research, we would like to see, whether this kind of investment and reallocation works in the same way in these kinds of environments. So, it's something that worth looking at it for the next few months.
All right. Well, good luck with that. Maybe we'll have you back to talk about that.
All right.
We get some results. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.